Nichols, no stranger to the majority of us, professor of government over at Claremont McKenna College, and our colleague teaches political philosophy. And he's going to be speaking on Tacitian Reflections on Republic and Empire. Please join me in welcoming Professor Nichols.
Thank you, Gwen. Tacitus is a little off the beaten track these days, unlike 300 or 400 years ago for political philosophers, so it's rewarding to see that so many of you were able and willing to turn out today. My first reading of Tacitus took place when I was a freshman, and I found it dreadfully boring. Tacitus himself is aware that there's something problematic about what he writes about. In the Annals, he refers to the fact that the kinds of things he's talking about, accusations, counter-accusations, poisonings, plots, and so on, don't really quite stand a fair comparison with the great victories of the Republic in Rome. He likewise expresses a kind of regret that the period he's talking about does not seem particularly interested in extending the boundaries of the Roman Empire, so that source of glory and excitement is missing. Nonetheless, he turns to an argument that what he's doing is useful and necessary to understand one of the basic types of government. So at first sight, there's something difficult and off-putting about Tacitus. Rousseau reflects a similar kind of problem in the Emile when he's reflecting on what historians Emile ought to read, and he reviews many of them before eventually settling on Plutarch as the best choice for someone young. And he says of Tacitus, of whom Rousseau himself is very fond, Tacite c'est l'historien des vieillards. Tacitus is the historian for old people, for old men. Why? Because Tacitus is very epigrammatic, a lot of brief formulations which, to appreciate which, requires long experience of human nature and human events. A young person looking to form his judgment and character and mold his aspirations is not quite the person most suited for reading Tacitus. This next time I read Tacitus was in graduate school. I was studying with, among others, Myron Rush, who is a Kremlinologist, best known then for a book called The Rise of Khrushchev, which originated as a Rand study and then was published more broadly. It was about, as you would guess, the movement to power of Khrushchev after the death of Stalin and how he managed to ace out the other competitors for power. And then quite recently he had published a broader gauge book called Political Succession in the Soviet Union. And I took a fascinating seminar with him which was called Succession Simply. And we studied, of course, his area of particular interest, but succession in other regimes, the British monarchy, the Shakespeare plays, on which we had a speaker visiting just last week or 2 weeks ago. And then we wrote term papers. In my term paper, I decided to do political succession in the Roman Empire from Augustus to Nero. And this covers, of course, this is the period covered by Tacitus's Annals. So I reread the Annals very closely then with questions of succession in mind. This time I found Tacitus really quite fascinating. I was captivated by his analysis of political power in the Roman Empire, especially monarchical politics, the power relationships going on at the court, his very interesting discussions of succession. A particularly interesting question to me then, not the one I was examining in terms of succession, but a very interesting question to me then was, could it have been possible during this period at some point to restore republican institutions instead of continuing with the imperial ones that had been founded by Augustus, continued by Tiberius and others? Now, it seemed to me that the best possible time that might have happened would have been when Gaius, also known as Caligula, was assassinated after only 4 years of rule. And the Senate might have been able to name someone. What had actually happened in the event was that the Praetorian soldiers, looking around for someone, found Claudius, hiding away in a back portion of the palace, and said, well, let's make him emperor. They remained loyal to the Julio-Claudian line and made him emperor. So I very much wondered at that time whether there might not have been a missed opportunity there for the restoration of Republican institutions. And unfortunately, I was not able to consult Tacitus on that point because that portion of his annals is missing. The annals, about half of it is preserved and about half of it is missing. So that was an unresolved question, and I thought of pursuing it then, but it didn't. Tacitus was the runner-up to be the subject of my PhD dissertation, and he lost to Lucretius. Many years later, arguably as un vieillard, I have now returned to the study of Tacitus, and further study has enabled me to see that the question which I was so very interested in before is unfortunately subject to a quite simple and adequate answer: no. It would not have been possible to restore Republican institutions there. That is Tacitus's judgment. It's right there, somewhat understated perhaps, but stated clearly enough that one can see that that is indeed his judgment. The most evident place would be in the very beginning of the annals. I might read a couple of little passages. In a chapter, well, I guess they're really paragraphs. Paragraph 3 of book 1 of the Annals. Speaking of the situation at the time of the death of Augustus, Tacitus writes as follows, and I give you Hobbes's translation. In the city, all was in quietness. The same names of magistrates. The younger sort were all born after the victory at Actium. That's when Caesar defeated the others. When Augustus defeated, what's his name? And even the old men were born in the time of the Civil War. How few were left that had seen the Commonwealth. The res publica, the republic, the Commonwealth, Hobbes' translation. And Hobbes, this, by the way, I will mention just by way of digression. Very interesting. I can, from my perspective, as you imagine, working on things like Plato and Tacitus, this is an extremely recent publication, 1995. Three discourses by Hobbes, edited by Arlene Saxonhouse and Noel Reynolds. They were very early writings in a manuscript called the Horae Subsequiae, and a study of them has convinced these authors that three of the several things in there were actually by Hobbes, written in 1620, hence the earliest things of Hobbes we have. And the one which, just in reading it, I feel confident is Hobbes, it just feels like Hobbes to me, is a discourse upon the beginning of Tacitus. He looks at the beginning of the Annals of Tacitus and does a line-by-line commentary on the first 4 paragraphs. Concerning what I just read, Hobbes comments that whosoever might have caused a desire of returning to their former liberty was now removed. Few remained that had seen the ancient republic. And Hobbes makes clear in good Hobbesian way why that is decisive. And there is never in men so strong a desire of things they have not seen as of those things which they have. Thought-provoking thought. Certainly true probably in the political realm, most of the time. And a man's nature is to stir more for the recovery of a good which they once enjoyed than for the acquisition of what they are ignorant of. As for the longing which might arise in them through relation and report, they had therein also some satisfaction. For whereas they might have heard the names of consuls, tribunes, censors, and the like, the same they found also in the present state, though the authority of them all remains